Decluttering isn't just as simple as grabbing a black trash bag and filling it up with items that no longer serve you. It can be a surprisingly emotional journey, can't it? And that comes with a lot of weight and burden for many of us. So if you are feeling that weight today, this video is for you because we're going to be diving into the many different emotional stages that happen when decluttering. Hey, I'm Katie Wells, and through this channel, my online programs, and my top-rated podcast called The Maximized Minimalist, I've helped thousands of people declutter their home and love their home again. So let's explore 4 different ways that emotions come up through the declutter process. Here's a few disclaimers. I want you to keep in mind that it is 100% okay to be sentimental. I see so many people get so frustrated with themselves and they say things like, if I weren't so sentimental, I would be further on in my declutter journey. I'd be able to let go of this stuff. And they look at it in a really negative, skewed way. And I get it. It is frustrating, but I want to be a soundboard for you and say that you can still remain a sentimental person and make progress in your declutter journey. So don't be so hard on yourself. Let's offer ourselves grace and compassion, okay? Number 2, there is a time and place to handle some of these sentimental things, and I want you to be easy on yourself, especially if you're going through items that maybe you've inherited from a loved one that's no longer with you. Yes, going through those items can be a very cathartic process, but it is a very emotional process. So if that is feeling too new and that wound is feeling too fresh, by no means should you ever rush into this. If you have a choice, just wait until you feel a little more emotionally ready to tackle it. And lastly, on its own, stuff is neutral. So you have to go within yourself, look in your heart, look in your mind, and try and discover why you are assigning meaning to these things we're talking about today. Because it's the meaning you're assigning to stuff that ultimately shapes your thoughts and your ability to either let go or not let go of it. By the way, here's a quick definition of what sentimental means. It means prompted by feelings of tenderness, sadness, or nostalgia. Okay, so now that we have that definition under our belt, let's dive in because this is so fascinating to me. And for some of you, it's going to be a light bulb moment. After working with thousands of students over the years, I've realized that a lot of sentimentality around certain things for certain people is actually just guilt showing up as sentimentality. You're feeling like you're struggling letting go of things because of a sentimental relationship with it, but really it's just rooted in guilt. And here's what I mean by that. I use the example of grandma's dishes all the time because I feel like it's so relatable. I've been there, and a lot of maybe you have too. So I used to think that I struggled letting go of grandma's dishes that I didn't need, I didn't use, I didn't want because they reminded me of her. But really that was just a surface level answer. Deep down, the main reason I wasn't letting those go was because I felt bad. And we talked about that on a recent video. So go seek that out if you get stuck in that guilt. But I think guilt kind of covers itself up with that sentimentality. So I think sometimes that takes just being a little bit more honest with ourselves. Maybe it means just asking tougher questions like feeling emotional or sentimental toward this item or piece, or is it rooted in guilt? Oftentimes, I would say the majority of the time, there's a big guilt component that once you can move past that, yeah, you can still be sentimental and those dishes can remind you of your grandma, of course, but if you really don't want them, you're going to be able to let them go much easier. Because here's the thing, you can still love your grandma, but you don't need to keep all of her stuff. So do a little soul searching, do a little digging, and ask yourself, am I keeping this more from guilt or am I truly sentimentally attached to this? And another answer for some of you here could be maybe you just repurpose it, or maybe you figure out a way to display it throughout your home instead of it sitting in a box. Or maybe you take a picture with it so you can reference that anytime you want to be reminded of that person. Remember, you can keep the memory without having to keep all the stuff. Okay, so number 1 was guilt. Is your sentimentality rooted in guilt? Number 2 is identity. Letting go of certain things can feel like this mourning of identity. And when we have this co-meshing and intertwining between us and our stuff, we can see this happen. So some examples are items that remind you of an identity you once had, you wanted to have. Maybe you don't have it yet, or you used to want an identity, but things have changed and you can't reach that identity anymore, that achievement even. Maybe it's an identity you hope to have someday, or maybe it's one that you wish you never had, right? It brings up a lot of pain and discomfort discomfort, and even grief. And so no matter what way that your stuff is tied to whichever identity I just talked about, and one way to combat this is to begin to understand that you are not your stuff and you are not defined by your stuff or your achievements or your accolades, whatever it is that's included in said identity. And sometimes when we are wrapped up in this identity, it can be like we just have this fantasy version of ourselves. So I want to share this story because in 2020, like millions of people around the world, I became obsessed with the Great British Baking Show. And after watching so many episodes and seeing these people just thrilled and passionate about baking and creating and being in the kitchen, and almost for a lot of people on the show, it was like it was therapy. It was therapeutic for them to work with their hands and really build and create these beautiful breads and cakes and all these things. And you can feel that passion as a viewer of the show. And so what did that do for a lot of people who watch the show? A lot of us non-bakers, I don't consider myself a baker necessarily, but I was like, maybe I should be a baker. Maybe I should take on that identity. And so when we want to achieve these identities, like if I want to be a baker now, I'm going to go out and buy things that a baker would buy, right? Maybe some baking equipment, some specialized tools, maybe even an apron to wear when I'm in the kitchen. Trust me, I was so tempted to hop on Amazon and buy like all these specialty tools and things that would make me feel like a baker and maybe even be like a better baker than if I didn't have all that stuff. And so interestingly enough, an identity or this fantasy version of yourself can not only create you to go out and just buy a ton of things, but let's say I did go buy all those baking tools, but then, I brought them home and like a lot of people, like my best intentions flew out the window. I didn't make the time to spend 4 hours making a loaf of bread and it just didn't work out. And so let's say I'm revisiting all of these little tools and accessories and my apron, which I never wore, when I'm decluttering my kitchen 6 months from now. If I'm still wrapped up in that fantasy version of myself, the person I hope to be or wish to be or want to be someday, I will struggle letting go of those things. Now wrap in the guilt, maybe the monetary guilt of, man, I spent $100 on all this stuff. I should probably try and use it. And so what a lot of us do is kick the can down the road and say, you know what, I'm going to keep this just in case one day I decide it's worth my time and energy to bake. Or, like when I somehow miraculously find a 5-hour window in my day to do all this baking I want to do, then I'll use it. But for 99% of us, that time never comes. And we keep coming back to declutter the same space only to not really make any progress, because I'll probably do the same thing the next time I'm back in the kitchen facing the same items. So it also keeps us stuck at a declutter perspective too. And I think once you understand that you are not your stuff, you are not your mistakes, you are certainly not your fantasy version of yourself, and that's okay, you are going to make so much more progress in your simplifying journey. Number 3 is seasons in life. We experience so many different seasons in life, don't we? And some of these seasons are accompanied by really, really intense emotions, some good and some bad. And items that remind you of a particularly emotional season tend to be more difficult to let go of, because when we pick that item out of a bin or a box and we haven't seen it or touched it in a while, sometimes we're flooded with those exact emotions during that season of life. And this aspect can absolutely tie in with that identity piece we just talked about too. So some examples I see often are baby stuff, right? As a mom or a parent or maybe a grandma, if you've ever raised kids, you maybe have felt like this pang when your kids are grown, or maybe you just know you're not going to be expanding your family and you need to get some of this baby stuff out of your house that isn't being utilized and won't be utilized in the future. But there's this big pang, right? Because when we become parents or caregivers for the first time, that is an intense season when you become a parent. Holy cow. And sometimes that season lasts a really long time, right? The emotional highs and lows. And so when we go to pack the crib up or pack up the baby items and donate that to someone, or even just the thought of it sometimes might bring tears to your eyes. This is why, right? We are emotionally complex human beings. Not everything is so black and white. And it's okay that you might feel emotional when you're facing these items. Maybe for you, it's you have boxes of nostalgic items from your childhood, things you've made in art class, drawings you painted, notes you wrote for your parents, maybe that they hung on to, yearbooks, trophies, whatever that is. When you pick up that trophy, you're probably going to remember the feeling you got when you crossed that finish line in your race and you won the race for the team, right? It's super exciting things. And also it can be on the polar opposite side of things. It can remind you of really challenging, tough times in life. Maybe for you, when you're looking at your college textbooks and you're struggling letting those go, it's because part of you not only defines minds, like your career and yourself is very intertwined in those textbooks, which I see often with people who hold achievement really high in their values and education and things like that. But maybe it was just really challenging. You remember the sleepless nights and all the time and energy you invested into reaching that milestone and getting that degree or hitting that career mark. As good as the emotions can be, they can also be on the other side of the spectrum. But no matter where you fall, where those emotions fall, they can often keep us stuck. And listen, I would totally love to be like, here's the hack on getting past that. Like say this, say this affirmation or use this checklist, step 1, step 2, step 3, but it doesn't work that way because we're human beings. We're not robots. So I fully wholeheartedly believe that the more you declutter and build your declutter muscle, that at some point you're going to get better at handling this type of item and recognizing that it's not serving you and you don't need it. I'm not an advocate for getting rid of every single sentimental thing and every single trophy and every single nostalgia item that's been collecting dust in your basement for years. And speaking of trophies, I want to share this story with you because when I was going through a lot of my childhood nostalgia items many years ago, while I was able to get rid of a lot, I did decide I was 100% okay keeping my trophy, but I wasn't okay with it sitting in a box like we just talked about. And so I thought, how could I display this item? And so I put it in my son's room on his dresser. He loves it. We talk about it all the time. And actually, my husband did the same with one of his trophies. So he got rid of the rest and he saved the one that he thought was the coolest, but also that was really the most meaningful for him. And we displayed them throughout our homes, and it's a really cool thing. So maybe there's an idea or two there for those of you who've been hanging on to all your trophies from childhood. All right, number 4 is a doozy, and it's really tied into loss and grief. I know firsthand that losing a loved one can be devastating, and sometimes we tend to hang on to the items that they gave us or that we just ended up with because it can feel like this material representation of their love and of their memory. I, for example, have jewelry and handwritten cards from both of my grandmothers, and they are priceless to me. But here's the thing, I didn't keep every single thing. I also didn't rush into the process. I gave myself time to process, which for me was a couple years. And then and only then when I was ready to offer myself compassion and grace is when I went through the items and decided how I was going to move forward. And as I've mentioned time and time again, instead of these items just sitting in a box collecting dust, I hang them, I put them throughout my home. I actually wear some of these pieces. And now these items, when I see them day in and day out, are really serving a much more, I think, bigger purpose. And they are there to spark that memory of my grandmothers or even make me smile when I walk past or offer that emotional support on those days I really need it. And to me, I think there's nothing really more beautiful than that. So if you found yourself in any of these 4 kind of emotional phases when it comes to decluttering, remember you are not alone. And the more you declutter and the more you tackle these things head on, the more easier it will get. The thing is, you may end up facing clutter again because it's a really easy cycle to fall into. So click the video on your screen now to learn how to end the cycle of clutter.